So I remember driving from when we broke through the lines finally into Kirkuk and Mosul. We're in white Toyota Hiluxes or Land Rovers, and there's just thousands of men. And once again, now I'm going back to like when I was a corporal. You're like, what do we do? Like this is our enemy. Like these guys were shooting at us 20 minutes ago. There were tanks idling on the side of the road, on the side of the road. There were rocket vehicles with still rockets in the tube, artillery that still was primed with artillery shells in it. I mean, it was minutes, but quickly humanity takes over, and it's just like, hey man, good luck, you know. And we were on to the next thing. Um, and then though, so that's March, right? March, April. By June, some of us in special forces, because we had relationships with the locals, were beginning to understand, oh, that was easy, but it ain't over. They've gone to ground. And even some of those officers that we bought off in the north, we ended up fighting them again, in Tikrit and Beji and in Baghdad, So they were very, very clever in not going head to head against the Americans and disappearing into the populace and then creating this insurgency. And I'll pause there because I'm talking a lot, but I definitely want to share something with you that I don't know if anyone has ever talked about. So that's my teaser, but I'll break for something. Yeah, anything you've got.
Well, no, because you just brought up the insurgency, and I know that you said you got to Delta in 2005, but because you brought up the insurgency, a lot of our younger viewers have probably never heard the name Zarqawi, who
Yeah,
was the face of evil for Al Qaeda in Iraq. Obviously, he gets killed in 2006, shortly about a year after you get to the unit. But did you have any experience with dealing with either Zarqawi or on the peripherals of his people? Because my understanding is Zarqawi's tradecraft and ability to avoid detection was top of the line. Is that
yeah,
true?
yes. So good segue. And yes, that was one of the very first things I witnessed in the unit was the Zarqawi. And Tom DiDamaso was the squadron commander who was responsible for that. And Tom is an American hero. He can be your third Delta Force officer to talk to. Tom was in Black Hawk Down as a Ranger lieutenant, but Delta Force was very much a direct assault, like hitting ops. Tom was one of the first guys, and this people may think differently, but I think a lot of the folks would agree. Tom was one of those first guys in the intel people that he had with him who was like, look, we have to have this thing strike to develop or develop to strike. Like we just can't hit and just capture, kill everybody. If we want to get to Zarqawi, we're going to have to be a little bit more patient, and we're going to have to like have the night of the long knives where we let some things sit, and on one night we go out and we bang 20, 30, 40 targets, because we're plucking these guys off the battlefield one by one, two by two. Zarqawi keeps kind of, slipping away. So it was a heavy lifting for a squadron commander to tell the unit commander or the JSOC commander all the way up to the presidential level, like, hey man, we're going to have a little bit of a lull in operations because I think it's going to lead to Zarqawi. And I had broken my leg in the operator training course, so I was actually downrange as a nobody. I was a battle captain working in the op center, just kind of observing and learning. And that was one of the very first things that I observed and learned was like, oh, this is what a Delta Force officer does. I mean, he's not needed on the fight, right? Like once you blow the door or blow the gate or you're on the target, there's very little room for that officer. The officer is the one who's sitting there and looking at the tactics and the strategy and integrating that for the most impact and effects. And that's how we finally end up getting to Zarqawi. So what I wanted to mention was people know ISIS, right? People know ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Well, before ISIS was the Islamic State of Iraq, just ISI, which people have already forgotten. And people don't know where ISIS or ISI came from. So when this insurgency grew with Zarqawi out of Fallujah and it spread, it was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQIZ.
AQI.
AQI, AQYZ, AQY. And Zarqawi and bin Laden were butting heads quite a bit, because bin Laden was like, hey man, like you're taking this a little too far. You know what I mean? Like this is, even the way that he was doing it and all this kind of stuff. And that was stuff that we constantly monitored. We constantly monitored these elements, Ansar al-Sunnah, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the big Al-Qaeda, all these different terror elements. We were constantly monitoring them, communicating with each other, because when they came together and aligned, now you've got 2, 3, 4 times the danger, right? So we were constantly trying to pull out, killing a guy who was trying to unify. You know what I mean? So those guys would come right to the top of our list. So that was something that was always interesting. When people wonder, like, what were you doing in Delta Force in Iraq? Well, we were one of the things we were doing was ensuring that all of these separate terror organizations weren't uniting. We were causing dissension between them. We were killing and capturing the ones that we needed to. We were trying to turn them against each other. It was a great game. It wasn't just banging doors and shooting guys in the face. That was a heavy part of it. But there was a great game that we followed on these relationships and how they were communicating and who was saying what to each other. And when Al-Qaeda in Iraq started to lose support of the people, because the Iraqi people were saying, hey, what's going on? Like, we're bearing the brunt of all of this. This is Al-Qaeda. Like, Zarqawi is Jordanian. He's not Iraqi. Like, Al-Qaeda is not Iraq. Like, this is Al-Qaeda in Iraq began to lose public support. So the insurgency was dropping. And Zarqawi, to his credit, created out of thin air the Islamic State of Iraq, ISI. And it really didn't exist, but he put a name on it. So now it wasn't Al-Qaeda in Iraq, this separate international organization that wasn't looking for the best interest of Iraq. He just renamed it ISI. And he put this guy in charge named Abu al-Baghdadi, which, again, people have begun to know that name. Well, dude, for a better part of a year, there was no guy. It was fake. So the Abu al-Baghdadi that would be on the radio, and he had a beautiful voice, that was a guy. And we killed that guy. But it wasn't Baghdadi. The guy that would come on TV was very handsome, and we killed that guy. And it wasn't Baghdadi. The guy that would communicate back and forth tactically to the troops, we killed that guy, and it wasn't Baghdadi. The guy that would communicate strategically to Al-Qaeda and the other insurgents movements around the world, that was a different guy, and we killed that guy. So this al-Baghdadi character was 5, 6, 8 different people that Zarqawi all created into this thing to build support for his movement, until finally they settled on a guy, al-Baghdadi. And he basically turned the tide from Iraqis not believing in what Al-Qaeda was doing. It was rebranded to ISI, and suddenly they were all about it again. And we watched all of this happen right underneath our nose, and we tried to keep up with it, and we tried to counter all of that propaganda. But it was just, it happened too quick.
At Zarqawi's peak before his death in 2006, is it fair to say that the government cared more about killing him than bin Laden at that point in time?
Oh, hands down. Yeah, hands down. And I think this was one of those things. When I was in the unit, I never once was looking for bin Laden. You know what I mean? I'm not saying we weren't looking for him, but we had him in a box. This is the way I understand it. And if you talk to other people, we had him in a box. He was very, very marginalized. And then our fear also was his second in command, Zawahiri, was much more capable. So it was like, with bin Laden in the picture and Zawahiri kind of relegated to, the VP, to the 2YC, we were able to kind of keep control of this. And I think that's where you saw, excuse me, all of these other Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, AQAM, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, turn into ISIS, all these things. I think that's where you were seeing these rebranding and this fractioning, because it was very, very difficult for bin Laden to control what was happening globally. So I don't know this for sure, because it really never came up. It was never something that I was involved in, but I do remember the discussions internal in the team room of, why aren't we going after this guy? And it really it's just symbolic, we're best off the way the situation kind of lays. But then there was always that moral win, like, hey, but he still needs to get his, and I think even when that did happen, it was interesting to see just how the country had this sigh of relief. I think I underestimated just how much that guy did live as a boogeyman in our conscience. If I had it all to do over again and I was in charge, I think I would have gone after him harder earlier. But we were definitely looking at the 20-meter target, which was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the burgeoning terrorism and insurgency in Syria, what was happening in North Africa, et cetera, et cetera.
This is all unbelievably fascinating. To tie Zarqawi and bin Laden, and then I want to kind of rewind a little bit to your process into the unit. Obviously SEAL Team 6 got bin Laden in Pakistan and Abbottabad, and they put together what they viewed was like the 23 best operators from what Red Squadron. They called it an all-star team, and that publicly and in books has been very clear. Like that all-star idea of we're just going to pick the 23 all-stars fractured that squadron, because the guys who didn't get picked were like, what, we're not good enough. In the unit, I interviewed a guy from the unit, and he talked about how like the idea of an all-star team would never happen. Like when you get to a squadron, it's like you're all capable. Do you agree? Like, does Delta have the all-star team, or if you're on a squadron and your number gets called, you're just gone?
Yeah. I think you told me when we get to the end of this discussion, we're going to talk a little bit about SEAL Team 6 and Delta. And I think that speaks volumes, right? You have an important mission, and you have to pick the best of the best out of your organization because you're not confident in who you have, as your everyday bench. It would never happen in the unit. And again, I say it somewhat tongue in cheek. Like, to me, that is a serious indictment on an organization, that you feel like your organic troop or your organic squadron doesn't have what it takes to get a premier mission. So we would never even think of that. Now what I will say is there is a lot of personality. One of my jobs as an officer was to sell our capabilities, our troop, our squadron. So it's funny because when people think about the military and they're like, oh, the president told them to do that. Man, the president's not telling us to do anything. We're telling the president what we think needs to be done. It's a very, very different relationship. If you're talking about Obama or Biden or Bush or Trump or whomever, like you're briefing them and their people like, hey, this is the number one bad guy. These are the conditions. And you basically establish this contract. So you write a con-op and it basically has the conditions where it's like, if we can identify this guy and isolate him with these parameters, are you going to give us the approval to launch? So that's constantly in motion, and I knew the bin Laden stuff was brewing because that contract was signed, so to speak. Like the contract with the Obama administration was kind of signed that said, if you guys are able to isolate him under these conditions, X, Y, and Z, and that's what we were constantly doing. I had some missions that were very, very sensitive, very contentious. And as the assault commander, it was my job to say, okay, if we can match these conditions, do you give us the go ahead? So it's not like the president ever wakes up and is like, I want you to go get bin Laden. It's building, just like the Zarqawi thing, where it's like, hey, here are the 8 things we need. We call them triggers. These are the 8 triggers that we need met. And when we meet those triggers, you're going to say launch. And that's how it works. So it's a very, very different relationship. Where was I going with that? So I think that's one of those things that I think people don't recognize and realize is the president, even the National Security Council, they are taking your input. They're taking your advice. You're telling them what we can and can't do and what that cost would come at.